All right, we are live. Let me welcome everyone for coming to our podcast for today. Now, last time we ran out of time when we had a exciting conversation with the Deputy Undersecretary, the Honorable Mr. Rafiq Mansour. And I know today we're going to run out of time again with my next guest, Dr. Barnett. But let me introduce him first. Dr. Barnett received his PhD from Harvard. Now, I know Harvard is not quite UCLA, but it's a pretty good school. He's been a professor at the U.S. War College. He worked under Donald Rumsfeld while at the Pentagon and wrote the Pentagon's new map, in which he predicted the rise of drone usage in modern warfare. And we'll talk about that today. He's a renowned geopolitical strategist. He's an advisor to a number of think tanks in the U.S. on U.S. foreign policies. And his latest book, America's New Map, details America's strategy going forward in a world with collapsing demographics for the West and climate change. Now, Dr. Barnett, first of all, welcome.
Thank you, Jason.
And, historically, for people who talk about global macro, who analyze geopolitics, the comfortable framework is the kind of East-West relationship. Like the West is more developed, wealthier, it's the consumers, right? And the East, poor, does all the work, but is catching up. And it's a very convenient framework. But increasingly, people are talking about the global South. And in your book, right, your analysis is much more North and South. So could you define for us the global South and why this new framework?
Well, the global South in the past, I would argue, did include much of East Asia and South Asia, India in particular. I would argue that after the peak globalization of the last 3-4 decades, say from 1990 to 2008, that's when we really consummated this integration process with East Asia. East Asia now risen, China now risen, and we're really looking at a North-South integration going forward as the more natural dynamic in the system. And there are reasons for that. Like I cite in the book, demographics, North is getting older, depopulating, South is still young. But the key thing, I think, to think about with the global South is that's the future of consumption. That's the future of growth. That's the future of your global middle class.
Got it. So this is really about integrating a new piece of the world, new consumers, new workforce, right? And then your thesis is that, look, the East is well integrated, and we probably aren't going through any decoupling, which we'll touch on later. Okay, so integrating the global South. So, all right, so a lot of the Southeast Asia is probably well integrated. So what is left to be integrated? And just how large is that population? And what do you project to be this new middle class, this new consumer class?
Right. Well, think back to, the end of the Second World War. What we thought of as a middle class was only about 1/5 of the global population. That doubles by 2000. We're up to about 2 billion. Okay, that doubles again by roughly 2020. We're up to 4 billion. And we're looking at roughly 6 billion out of 10 come mid-century. So we're adding, at this point in history, roughly 3 billion consumers from a past that was overwhelmingly unpackaged, unprocessed, unbranded in terms of consumption, to one that is processed, packaged, and branded. And we know that when you have these people coming into, adulthood, their early choices in terms of brand loyalties tend to stick with them for quite some time. So when I think about the global South and what's going on in this global middle class, to me, it's both the problem and it's the prize. You cannot not be about tapping that market because it is going to be so huge. It's going to drive growth. It's going to drive consumption, and it's going to drive North-South integration. But at the same time, you got this fear about immigration, and you have this very incredibly disruptive event, development of climate change, which is going to hit.
Dr. Barnett, I'm going to pause you on the climate change because we're going to get to that because that's super important.
Sure.
But I do want to emphasize a point that you made, which is probably less frequently made, especially in the East-West framework and much less the global South framework, which is thinking of rise of a new consumer class. Like, I think we generally think of rise of new workforce, and this allows America to continue to consume more because there are more people working cheap for you. But you are focused on the rise of the consumer class, and we know consumption, the ability to consume, is power in of itself. So talk a little bit more about that. And I think in that context, how is America tapping that? And competingly, China is looking to tap that as well. And you made it very clear. He who can capture and build brand early on, maybe looking at 3 billion new consumers going their direction.
Well, in terms of capturing the market, I think the key thing to think about is, it's the infrastructure that goes in that connects both, literally cements a country's connectivity with the outside world. And then there's the software connection that gets layered on top. And the latter one's actually as important or more important, because if you think about it, in the modern world, you put a smartphone in somebody's hand. If that's your smartphone, if that's your 5G network, if you're the person who's layering around that individual their communication networks, their transaction networks, their media networks, and everything else, then you have access to sort of their digital soul, and you can grab all that big data over time, put that into your AI machinery, make it that much smarter, and then you're anticipating, and on some level, you're conditioning. You're getting them used to being served by you in the way that you might want to serve them. And if you think about the East versus the West in that regard, in the West, we have, Amazon wants to get inside your head. They want to own everything they can of yours. So does Google. So does Microsoft. So they're all competing, okay? In China, there's a lot more collaboration there. And that's what I call China's quantum grand strategy. Not so much grabbing chunks of the world, but grabbing future consumers and bringing them into their infosphere. And on that basis, not just mining all that big data, not just meeting all that demand, but conditioning them to see a world in Chinese terms versus a world in American terms. And that's
fascinating.
Challenging.
Yeah, because Dr. Burnett, as you're talking, right, I'm already thinking TikTok, right? TikTok, obviously a Chinese platform. And because TikTok has become so popular in the US, and you can tell us whether that's popular in the global South as well, because it's been so popular in the US, it's actually done a really good job of pushing even some Chinese brand into American consumer consciousness, right? Like I think Alibaba and Temu, which is Pinduoduo, have had some success in the US because TikTok has allowed China to understand American consumers a lot better than before, right? It doesn't have to lean on just Costco and Target and Amazon. So how is that happening in the global South, right? Are we seeing China rising as a dominant brand, a dominant distribution and influencer there? And what has been the American strategy? I think America may be kind of slow in getting to the global South.
Or misdirected. Yeah.
Misdirected.
Think about China as the last in to global value chains over the last 30, 40 years. And the last in is the next up to integrate its replacement. As it moves up the production ladder to higher end goods, it needs to slot in replacements to deal with the lower end manufacturing, okay? Right now, that's Southeast Asia. That's where the demographic dividend is. It shifts to India over time. But China's response here in terms of a Belt and Road Initiative absolutely makes sense. They should be doing that. We should want them to do that. But there is a bit of a Trojan horse strategy going on here. It's not just, hey, we'll build those ports, we'll build those railroads so we could take out minerals, we could take out food and this and that. But I know you want to get connected too, says China. I'll give you the 5G routers. I'll give you the 5G phones. I'll give you all this stuff super cheap. I'll make it easy for you. And I'll bring in this safe city solution, which sounds like an anti-crime thing, but it's also a good model for a very Orwellian surveillance state to which they will maintain backdoor access. And then you start discovering that the Chinese are arresting people on your soil and operating secret police stations within your boundaries. And you start to realize, I've kind of taken the red pill here. And I'm kind of in China's matrix. If I'm just getting everything from TikTok and Alibaba and WhatsApp, well, then China is shaping that infosphere, that universe. Plus, it's learning everything it can about me. So that thing they have going on inside China now, social credit system, is kind of a Black Mirror harbinger of a future where they get to condition us, in effect, and say, this is what makes your score go up higher. This is what makes your score go down lower. And the more of the global middle class that they grab that way, they're really kind of indoctrinating them to a different perspective, one they're much more comfortable with, but one that strikes us as very anti-democratic.
Now, Dr. Barnett, I know the global south doesn't get a lot of play, and I think in the media in the US, it's largely ignored or it's viewed as a collection of underperforming economies and dictators. Right. But you talked about it as this is important, right? You got to integrate it. You got to have a strategy there because it's billions of people who will become your customers. It's billions of people who could enter into global trades. So can you sort of quantify, make that sort of big and impactful for us? Because I think many of us probably still think of global south as negligible, unimportant, probably even outside of our traditional sense of the emerging markets, like the frontiers markets, and it just doesn't matter that much from an investment perspective.
Right.
So unconvince us why we shouldn't ignore it.
Think of the demographic dividend that's sort of defined the center of gravity in globalization since the end of the Second World War. America had it first. We were going to rule forever. Then the Japanese had a 3-decade baby boom, and they were going to rule the world forever. And then China kicked off its, one-child policy, got that demographic dividend, and then they were going to rule the world. But in each instance, they start getting old, and then there's a new, younger pool following it. Now it's Southeast Asia. Soon it's 500 million young people entering the workforce and consumption in India. And then mid-century, 2 out of 5 humans on this planet are going to be young and African. Okay? So when I see things like DEI getting criticized or getting blowback, I can't believe it on some level because, the future of globalization, to be blunt, is going to be non-Western, non-European, non-American.
Ooh, I think Dr. Barnett's a little frozen on my side.
You need it in your workforce to be able to access all that diversity and create the kind of inclusion that gets you a market you can still work with 10, 15 years down the road. Think back to when the middle class started to appear in the West at the turn of the 20th century. You got Bolshevism from the left, okay, wanted to prevent the rise of the bourgeoisie. You got fascism, Germany, Italy from the right, wanting to protect the shopkeepers against the communists and socialists. And then you got the Roosevelts and the progressive era in the United States. A middle class rules itself, okay? We're rerunning that experiment on a global scale, okay? You got the right in terms of ethno-nationalism, okay, and fascism, like a Putin, like all those strong men, like a lot of things that Trump, frankly, promises to make America if he gets another chance. On the left, you got that single party autocracy. In China, you got the same players. We still call each other the same names, commie, Marxist, socialist, blah, blah, blah. Okay? In the middle, where are the champions for self-rule by the middle class? I would argue right now, the closest we have to that is Modi and a government that proudly declares itself a social welfare state in India. And that's why India is so important to the future. It's kind of the swing vote. If you think of kind of 5 big players in the system, United States, Europe, Russia, India, China, you got 2 authoritarians there, Russia and China. You got 2 democracies, United States and Western Europe. Sort of the rubber match is India going forward.
Yeah, and it's super interesting. So, Dr. Barnett, you mentioned, before the global south will rise and dominate, right? India seems to be kind of the next China, right? Right. It's going to bring a new 500 million new young workforce into the system. So obviously critically important in terms of, I think, global workforce. And with that, hugely important as a new consumer market. But right. More importantly, hugely important as almost a tiebreaker, right? Because you just mentioned like the 5 superpower, one emerging is India. So talk to us about India, because I know U.S. is trying to court India. Now, India's been quite coy and quite strategic, right? India made that famous saying, right? India's not on anyone's side, right? India's on its own side. So talk to us about it. What is it? What is India's strategy? And of course, can America reliably count on India, first of all, to rise as the next China, but also to be America's ally?
Right. I mean, a lot of this comes down to how you view the world and the future. You know, if you throw your hands up and say VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, or the other one, BANI, brittle, nonlinear, anxious, incomprehensible. Sounds like, you know, my four millennials, or I have two millennials and four Gen Z kids. I would say my millennials are sort of VUCA, and my Gen Zs are sort of BANI. You know, very much like a comfortable living in a computer world kind of uncertainty. I think those terms are all terms of surrender. I think there are ways to look into the future, think about it sensibly, focus on inevitabilities, and then start wrapping your mind around some of the inconceivables you will undertake in terms of responses to deal with those inevitabilities. India is a great example. India, okay, is coming in on China's tail in many ways, okay? Demographic dividend right now in Southeast Asia, everybody's sending their money there. That's the China plus one strategy. We think we're decoupling or de-risking, but China's just moving up the production ladder and slotting in Southeast Asia behind them. India comes on next. The notion that we can get India to help us to box in China going forward is a fool's errand. They're not going to do that because they understand they need access to Chinese foreign direct investment. That as a recent integrated force within the global economy, China is a natural source to integrate India. So managing that relationship and China being comfortable with India's rise, I mean, that's the key bilateral, bipolar kind of situation, if you want to draw one, inside Asia. This notion that Europe and the United States is going to get India to kind of box in China across East Asia, I think is a mistake, because India joins those global value chains. And then as it joins those global value chains, it needs to move up over time to higher end manufacturing. Guess who India's slotting in? India is the big answer for Africa. And China will also be huge, but the two of them are really going to integrate Africa. And you can look at that and say, wow, that's, you know, we're not in charge. America's not the key player here. This is a crazy, uncertain world, or it's a, or let me slap on some labels from another century. I'll contain them. We'll have a Cold War. We'll schedule World War III over Taiwan. I mean, these answers that are really kind of backward looking, when the reality is, you know, who wants to deal with that Africa mid-century? It's not going to be Europe so much. It's not going to be the United States. It's going to be China and India. So India's integration over time with China's help sets up India to be the big integrator follow-on to Africa.
All right, so that's put it on some time scale, because I think for many of the participants on this call, they're thinking about investment policies, right? And so time scale is important, right? So you talked about like China, and as China move up the value chain, Southeast Asia slots in very quickly, India slots in after that, and then it's Africa. So in terms of time scale, right? How long is it going to take for let's say Southeast Asia to fully integrate? Right? Obviously, we're seeing a lot of foreign direct investments from China going to Vietnam, going to Malaysia, right, especially Thailand, right? India is slowly coming online. I know some of the earlier factories being set up by the Chinese and the Taiwanese in India hasn't worked as well. Perhaps it's what you mean by they're next after Southeast Asia. So give us a sense of timeline. When can we expect India to fully rise and really be where China is today?
So think of America's demographic dividend, 1950s, 1960s, the golden age, we were going to rule forever, Mad Men, all that kind of stuff. Then the Japanese come along, 70s and 80s, and they're all scary, except all of a sudden they start to turn really old in the early 1990s. Then you got the Chinese, 90s, 2000s, okay? You get to 2008, you get the global financial crisis. Their demographic dividend peaks around 2010. And all of a sudden, we're talking about China plus one and going to where the next demographic dividend is right now, 2010s, 2020s. That's Southeast Asia. You got China, you got India beyond that, really 2025 to about 2040. And then you have Africa and the Middle East, 2040 to 2050, 2055. And that's why, you know, we argue at Throughline, you can visualize these futures. It's not crazy. It's not uncertain. It follows certain logic, okay? And it just forces you to think about things that, you know, in the past may have seemed inconceivable, but now are kind of staring you in the face. You know, 2 out of 5 humans in the world, 2050 going to be young and African. Okay, if you're not about young and African over time to anticipate the rise of that demand center, that manufacturing center, all that consumption, all the big data created by all that consumption, then you're not going to be a serious player going forward.
Yeah, and just for our audience benefit, so I'll also talk about, when you think about demographics bonus, right? It isn't just if a country is experiencing demographic bonus and is sort of peaking in terms of, pushing sort of workforce into global trades, right? It's not just about the country itself capturing benefit. It's actually a lot of the early days, the Western countries who seize that opportunity, who come in, co-invest, who come in and build brand and capture the market and really tap that workforce. So I think when China was hitting its sort of maximum demographics bonus, the biggest beneficiary were the Americans, right? So having tapped that market and opened up that market, and the Japanese as well, right? Because they were right before China. And really, right now, China is probably now finally benefiting from all the demographics bonus that it has itself created, because now it has a wealthy consumer segment and is starting to look at the rest of Southeast Asia and deploying this one build, one growth strategy. So I think that kind of takes us into a bit of a minor pivot to talk about kind of the build and grow strategy. I think it's something that gets talked a lot, and no one really, I think, talked about it the way you do, right? Which is a way to sort of connect China with other countries to capture their consumer, right? Right now, a lot of people think of that as sort of some kind of military expansion, some kind of, cynical tentacle, getting into the politics of other countries. So, Dr. Barnett, tell us your interpretation of what China is doing with its build and grow strategy.
Well, this is another example of one of these situations where, as we like to say, a through line, you got to figure out how people view the world, okay? How you view the world depends on what game you think you're playing, okay? The United States, we're very mercantile, okay? We're all about poker, It's all about how bad do you want that pot? Can I bluff you? Can I fool you? Can I raise the ante? It's that kind of stuff, okay? And you see it right now in Ukraine. Every other week, we put down a new weapon and say to Putin, basically, match it or call, okay? Putin doesn't play that game whatsoever, okay? They play chess. He's all concerned about the big pieces. He will send pawns across all day long. He doesn't care how many he loses, okay? Meanwhile, these two going at it, really focused on Ukraine, there's China playing Go on a global game board. And China is just patiently putting down a stone, a stone, a stone. And on that basis, creating these little safe zones that they can control because they're highly networked and highly surveilled. And it connects them to other parts of the world. And once they get into your country, they want to start laying some stones across your country in terms of infrastructure, in terms of 5G networks, because they want the Internet of Things to be under their umbrella over time, so they can get the AI of things, which gives them all sorts of control and influence. They're not just market players, they're market makers, okay? And, think back to the United States, end of the Second World War, we decided to be the great market maker on the planet. We played that role for 7 decades, roughly, to about 2008. And then we sort of said, you know what? There's too much competition now. We got what we wanted, which was multipolarity, but now it scares the hell out of us. Too much competition. And so we had this knee-jerk reaction towards populism and basically kind of moved in the direction we needed to, which was we needed to tone down our market-making responsibilities and start looking out for number one more. But because we're Americans, we don't do anything half-assed or partially. When we get change, we go totally in the other direction, declare the past to be a total lie and a conspiracy and whatnot. And that's kind of where the debate is struggling right now. We're very scared. We feel betrayed by this globalization that we kind of created and unleashed upon the world. Frankenstein's monster, we call it in the book. And now it seems to have more impact on us than we have on it. It's no longer controllable. We don't see ourselves in the future. And so when China's laying these stones everywhere, it looks ominous, but what are we doing? We're fixating on containment. We're coming up with these 20th century answers. So the West right now is trying to contain the East. Meanwhile, the East is is integrating the South. And if we're not careful, we're going to find that the Chinese have basically integrated Latin America, which we've spent the last century ignoring and not integrating. You know, our trade openness with Latin America remains low. Our trade integration with Latin America remains very low. We're nowhere near what the Europeans are in terms of intra-regional trade. Same with East Asia. And we may find ourselves looking down and seeing Latin America 10, 15 years from now, largely run by the Chinese. And we're not going to be happy with that, because think if they take out all the resources and Latin America comes under really heavy stress from climate change, you know, those immigrants are not going to China. They're coming to the United States. So as I like to say, China has no problem beggaring our neighbors. And if we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves really unhappy. And we shouldn't be, because this regionalization, this nearshoring, friendshoring, everything is saying, you know, bring it back a little closer, a little more resilient. We should be thinking about Latin America very aggressively. And we should ultimately be about socializing the risk that they're going to experience in terms of climate change, which we're already seeing, and it's profound.
Yeah, Dr. Barnett, I'm going to leave a lot of time on climate change, because in the Q&A box, someone's already asking about the geography issue. But before we get there, you mentioned something that's actually quite fascinating. Right? Again, I want to address kind of the standing biases that you know our audience tend to hold for Latin America and Africa, which is we think of these as emerging economies that never emerge, right? So worrying about them seems useless, because we were all expecting them to rise and be big, be important, but they seem to go through unstable administrations, bad to horrible, you know, currency and macro policy. So never rise, so they don't ever matter, right? Certainly, if you look at investor portfolios for even a lot of our more educated investors, you know, emerging markets outside of, if you take out emerging Asia, it's almost negligible, non-existent. They don't even invest in it. And that, I think, is a U.S. bias, right? And perhaps China thinks about it differently. So why is, in this case, the U.S. potentially wrong to ignore Latin America, to ignore the rise, the demographics bonus that you referred to for Africa? Why can't we just comfortably assume that they will never rise and they'll always get in their own way?
Well, you know, part of it has to do with the time distance from today America and the integrating frontier conquering kind of America, say, of 100, 150 years ago. So, you know, we go to an Africa and we look and we see all sorts of problems businessmen do. Yep. China, because it just went through that experience not that long ago, Chinese businessmen go there, they look at it and they say, I understand exactly what's going on. I know exactly how to build from the ground up. And that sort of makes sense. And I'm not arguing against that. I don't think the United States is going to compete seriously with China and India in integrating Africa, because, you know, we have that fear of competition right now. We're undergoing a racial makeover in our country that's rather profound as we become more like the world. That's creating a lot of political polarization. So my argument for a grand strategy right now in the United States is not to try to take on the Chinese everywhere. It is to split the difference between our nativist, isolationist impulses right now and our history of being this market-making Leviathan force. Split that difference and say, I'm not going to try to out-integrate China and East Asia. But by God, I should be able to do it in Latin America. And if I'm not, and I'm looking at this north-south future with all sorts of climate pressures, and I got people showing up at my border at a rate I can't deal with now, if I'm not socializing that risk latitudinally, north-south, I'm going to find myself in worse and worse situations. And it's going to make me even that much more reactionary and more willing to build and hide behind walls. And that's just ceding the global south and all that power and all that consumption and all that influence to the Chinese and others. And maybe it works out and maybe it doesn't, but I don't think America wants to be that much of a bystander going forward.
Now, Dr. Barnett, I think, one thing that we almost can't avoid addressing is when you talk about integration, right, it feels a little more comfortable, right? It feels like, integration is just everyone climbing this ladder with U.S. still being the center of gravity, right? Still being the kingmaker, the rules maker, and it's still, we call it the U.S. hegemony or the unipolar world.
Right.
But I think there's a sense, especially because global South wants to have its own currency now. There's a sense that it's maybe not integration. Maybe it's a almost a gradual separation into a bipolar world. So I think it's probably useful for you to address that as well. And I think in the context of that, right, when we're talking about China putting pieces on the board, maybe it's a 5G network here and there, but the pieces U.S. has already put down, right? I think in your book you talk about 90% of the world's military bases are owned by the U.S., right? Like we got pieces everywhere, right? So can the world truly become bipolar, right? Can others truly put down pieces?
Well, a lot of it has to do, with the fact that we have this inherited sunk cost called the U.S. military and our worldwide global presence. And if you think about what is that designed to prevent, that's designed to prevent country A from attacking country B. Because our big lessons with World War I and II were, if you don't respect state sovereignty, you're going to get these giant conflagrations, and we're all going to end up in World War III eventually. So it is sacred to defend borders. And we've created this huge legacy force and this huge global footprint to prevent that. And now we've been, kind of activated by Russia going into Ukraine. We see that as potentially the end of the world. The way we cast China potentially going into Taiwan is apocryphal, apocalypse now kind of fear. But if you do the counterfactuals on either, for example, say Ukraine decided to join Russia like Belarus did, does it change the strategic environment? Not really. Okay, say Taiwan decided to join China on its own. Would that change the global order? Not really. So, are we smart in putting so much of our money and our bet on the future on these very narrow scenarios that I think when you read 22nd century histories of the 21st century, these are not going to be chapters. These are going to be little sidelight boxes off on page right. So I think it's key for us to understand that the shift toward cyber right now is kind of overwhelming what has been our long-term focus on preserving state sovereignty. Okay, have we put up a good fight through Ukraine against the Russians in that part of the world, that conflict? Absolutely. We're good at that. We can send them all sorts of weapons, all sorts of new stuff. We'll support them, not a problem. Putin, I would argue, through the web, through influence operations, has captured a big chunk of the GOP base in America. And he didn't have to spend bajillions of dollars to do it. It's very cheap. Okay. And then you think about the Chinese with TikTok and everything else, and you start to realize all these influences that we see largely in terms of election interference, which we are offended by, naturally. We're not paying attention to the fact that a lot of this competition is subnational, transnational. It has to do with kind of cyber snatching other countries' citizens, turning their mindset to your way, and on that basis winning. It's not who rules the heartland of Europe in this 20th century kind of land conquest focused mindset that we have that's very much informed by World War II and what we set up to prevent World War II. Great. Can we spend $1 trillion a year from here on out to prevent country A from attacking country B? To me, that's not the future. The future is winning hearts and minds. You start with stomachs and wallets. You get into those networks. You capture them within your infosphere. That's where your real influence is. That's the competition we got going on with China. It's not about state sovereignty. It's about a very digitalized future globalization. If you go back and look at 2000, the value of digital components within global trade was negligible, below 10%. Now it's estimated to be more than half. That is a big signal. That's the power and influence.
So I'm going to interrupt and summarize a little bit because in the chat box, people are saying, hey, they want to hear a bit more about Belt and Road. So I'll summarize because I think you said tremendous amount, right? Because I think part of integration is, at the end of the day, the Belt and Road strategy that China is implementing, right? It's trying to integrate Central Asia. It's trying to integrate Southeast Asia, bringing all of that into its sort of manufacturing ecosystem, right?
Sure.
And into the infrastructure ecosystem, and potentially it could be successful doing so in in India, and certainly it looks like it's doing very well in integrating Africa. So I think everyone should understand is the core of the Belt and Road strategy. Right? It's not
Absolutely.
China laying down military bases as a way to win
Right,
over people
right,
or
right,
contain people, but it's a
right.
way of China, supplying infrastructure, and through supplying infrastructure, bringing its manufacturing ecosystem and bring other countries into that network. That
Right.
that's how China is winning. So I think that's critical for everyone to understand the Belt and Road strategy from that
Very
context.
different game. Very different game.
Very
We'll
different game.
own the naval base and the carrier off the coast. They'll own the port.
Yeah.
And the question
And so
is, more power going forward in that equation. And I think it's going to be increasingly them if we're not careful.
So is that, does that move toward sort of over time? I think there's fear, but perhaps over time, this is just how the world gradually sort of integrate and everyone moves up the value chain. Or does it create a bipolar world? And I kind of bring us back to that word because, the U.S. is, as you say, it's got bases everywhere. It's got the old containment strategy, and as you mentioned, and that may be less relevant because increasingly, even if war and military is important, it's increasingly going to be cyber warfare. It's going to be drone, right? So I think that's something to think about.
Right.
And of course, right now the U.S. is still at the center of the universe because more than anything else, more than our military bases that keep everyone in check, it's the dollar, right? Perhaps our greatest weapon, and perhaps our greatest weapon that we shouldn't use easily. Because it's at the center of the financial system. Everything go through that system, which may be why the Global South is trying to have its own currency and perhaps a different clearing system. So I know I asked a lot of questions, but they're all related, right? They're related to, can the U.S. be at the center of the universe? If the military aspect is perhaps less relevant, if the integration can only be done by China, because integrating these new economies is about integrating them into a manufacturing ecosystem, then what we have is the dollar, right? The financial system we still control.
Right.
So let's talk about that, the financial system.
I mean, the Belt and Road, as I said earlier, absolutely necessary, and it's a positive development, and it should unfold, and we shouldn't be about sabotaging it or wanting it not to work because we're not offering an alternative. And it's more important that these parts of the world are integrated by the large scale savers in the system of recent years and decades. And that was China. It's not the United States. The United States has been running a deficit and building up its debt tremendously. And it can do so because it doesn't have external discipline forced upon it because we're the reserve currency. That discipline is coming though. It's inevitable, and it'll actually be a good thing because it'll force us to adapt over time. And so I'm sanguine when I hear things like the BRICS increasingly, dealing in their own money, trying to think about a swapping currency or buying lots of gold around the world and anticipating that kind of move. I think that's all good stuff for us because I think until we get some external discipline, we're going to continue to spend our way into worse and worse situations. And we're going to be not realistic about maintaining a military that is designed to kind of police the entire world. So yeah, we will not be the center of global order going forward. It's going to be a multipolar situation. We sought it. Now we're nervous about it. And when those who step up into these new poles, these new roles like the Chinese, the Chinese want a big Navy to go with their worldwide network of global value chains. That totally makes sense, unfortunately, but we find it very threatening. And they do things, that are stupid and raise too much of a threat, like putting way too much military hardware and guns pointed at Taiwan when they already have an overmatch. So it's just an overkill that drives up a lot of tensions. But, we got to be realistic about what we can do in the future and where we can lead. And as I see this climate change increasingly coming to dominate and supersede our definitions of East-West crises and East-West competition, I think the fact that we're well positioned in the Western Hemisphere, I enunciate this throughout the book, in terms of resources, in terms of complexity, in terms of our racial makeup, our future North-South integration in the Western Hemisphere, much easier than Europe plus the Middle East plus Africa in the center, or, the complexity that is East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Russians in the Far East, all that kind of stuff. We have a much better future, but we need to start signaling our willingness to do that sort of north-south integration, because if we don't, the Chinese will wrap up Latin America before we know it. And frankly, think about younger generations in America and their declining sense of patriotism and national identity. They're not up for a Cold War with China. They're not up for World War III over Taiwan, over Ukraine. They're not really up for much on the Middle East, as they've demonstrated with Israel versus the Palestinians in the last year or so. They are very focused on north-south. They're very focused on equity, fairness. They're very focused on climate change. They're very concerned about the immigration problem. All those things are things we can deal with by pursuing north-south integration in the Western Hemisphere, kind of splitting the difference between our isolationist impulses, which are high right now, and our tradition of wanting to kind of shape the world and shape our future. I think that's the answer going forward. If we can't integrate Latin America, where else are we going to,
Now, Dr. Barnett, I think this is perfect, because I think we're finally getting into another very big topic, controversial one, for a variety of reasons, which is climate change, and why that gives the U.S., gives the West still an advantage to integrate north-south, right? I think we've established that China has an enormous advantage because it owns sort of the manufacturing ecosystem to integrate Southeast Asia, perhaps India, and then Africa. But the West owns something that is equally important: water and geography, right? But this only comes into focus if you accept the premise of global climate change, right? Because I think a lot of people, sort of get worked up on climate change because they feel like they have to do something to stop climate change. But I think what you have detailed in the book is much better, right? It's like, look, it's just happening. That's not worried about why it's happening, right? It could be Earth, it could be anything, right? But it's happening, right? Just you can't ignore the fact that it's happening. It's about what can you do, not in terms of can you reverse it, but what can you do so that this, sort of impending disaster either work to your favor, or at least you're not sort of broadside by it. So talk about your thesis on climate change and how it creates a path for the West to be incredibly relevant in the North-South integration.
Sure. Think back to your Jared Diamond. What he basically said in Guns, Germs, and Steel was that the wide parts of the world developed faster than the tall parts, because there was that vast environmental sameness that stretched all the way from Ireland to Japan. If you figured out anything in that vast band, it pretty much worked throughout. So they developed faster. They conquered the tall parts of the world that ended up being colonies, the Americas, where we all speak European languages as a result. Africa, which has the same kind of situation, a lot of Francophile and English and whatnot. The conquering of those tall parts, that was kind of preordained by the geography and the advantages that the environment gave you if you lived in that vast belt running from Ireland all the way to Japan, where all the major civilizations were formed. Think about climate change, though. What it's going to do is it's going to decimate the lower latitudes. 30 degrees north and south of the equator, I call it Middle Earth. It's about half of humanity. It's where the bulk of future global middle-class growth is going to occur. This thing's coming to decimate agriculture, drive people off the land into the cities. Cities become unstable. You try to make it there, and if you're desperate enough, you head north. Okay, so imagine the immigration pressures the United States has today. Imagine them 10, 20, 50 times stronger in 3 or 4 decades. Okay, are we going to be able to handle that flow? Are we going to be able to repel that flow? I argue we need to start looking at that future as an opportunity in addition to a responsibility. We need to socialize that latitudinal risk, which in the Western Hemisphere is not that bad, because if you look at our lower latitudes, a lot of it's water, okay? And we stretch to both poles pretty much. So we have less exposure on climate change, and we have more relief factor north and south, because because what you're seeing in the world today are species, the planet over, moving towards the poles and up in elevation. And we have, relative to the number of people being exposed in the lower latitudes in the Western Hemisphere, we got a lot of space up above called Canada. Okay. And North America.
Right, so US invades Canada? Is that kind of where we're going?
Well, where we're going is, you can only repel so much. You can only keep so much of a population resiliently in place in these lower latitudes, which are really starting to turn into, the best comparison point is the Saharan Desert in terms of temperature and precipitation. Doesn't mean they turn into a desert overnight, but Phoenix, 100 days, over 100 degrees. Phoenix telling itself it can't grow anymore because its water tables are being, just gone through at a very rapid pace. We're seeing the limits of people being able to live in lower latitudes along our southern coast, which is right around 30 degrees north of the equator. And we can either deal with that problem by integration, or we could try to build a wall and shoot them all at the border. European Union decided after the Cold War that it wanted to integrate East Europe. It didn't do so because it was going to make a lot of money right off. It did so to bulk up its demand function, its consumption power, its overall economic capacity, and to deal with problems down the road if Russia ever got resurgent again, like we all assumed it would eventually, and it did. Okay, so they made that integration effort eastward. Okay, I would argue a European Union has to start thinking southward now, because it's doing things like, as the Washington Post recently investigated, it spent €500 million secretly giving money to North African governments to take all those migrants that are coming across from sub-Saharan Africa, take them, dump them in the middle of the Saharan Desert. Okay, that's their answer for now. It's not a very good answer. It's not
a horrible answer. My God.
It's pretty close to a war crimes sort of answer, if you really want to be honest. And we've seen these kind of violent situations. The Saudis executed about 1,000 Ethiopian immigrants coming across the Yemen border a few years back. We've seen the Italian Coast Guard let a ship go down with 250 souls. And we're talking all sorts of nasty stuff at our border. Okay. And I look at that and I look at future generations and I say, my kids aren't signing up to kill Latinos coming across the Rio Grande. That's not the future America they want to be part of. So if you want them to have a strong sense of identification, deal with the problems they think are paramount. Climate change is one of them. They worry about immigration and the pressures that we're facing. They worry about the aging of our population. That, to me, all those things say integrate southward. Rush towards that future. If you think Honduras is going to survive the next 3-4 decades all by itself, on its own, I think you're very optimistic. I think Honduras would be better off part of a larger North-South union over time that integrates Latin America, just like European Union will ultimately have to turn towards North Africa and come up with something different. Just as I expect the Chinese to kind of increasingly muscle northward into Siberia and become a polar power on that basis, I expect the Indians to do very similar things across Central Asia in coming years as well. I see all these vertical, on a wall map, vertical integration, north-south pressures coming. And if we're not smart about doing our slice of the world, we won't be in a good position to compete on the other slices. So if we can't do it here, where can we do it is the argument. And I will argue that dealing with that kind of situation, thinking along those lines is really much more attractive to upcoming generations than the stuff we're selling them right now, which is we're all going to hell, planet's going to hell, we're going to fight with China, that's your future.
We can solve it by not having cows, though.
Yeah, right. It's not a future anybody wants to belong to. And if your citizens don't believe in your country and don't identify with it, your country can cease to exist. That's what happened with the Soviet Union. It can disappear when people stop caring about it, because then they don't identify with it and they won't sacrifice for it. And America is at risk along those lines, and which is why we need some sort of national project, which I would argue climate change based, north-south integration based, deals with immigration, those are the kinds of things we need to work towards, not trying to divide the world between us and China and calling it World War III or containment or Cold War II or whatever you want to call it.
Now, Dr. Barnett, the last 5 minutes has been very aspirational, right? You documented the problem, and I think the problem is clear, right? I mean, you just look at Phoenix, right? And you can extend from there.
Right.
And you talked about, look, when it becomes a external event, right? And you have people coming from the south going up to the north for survival reasons, right? The border crisis, humanitarian crisis. So all of that very, it's a gloomy future. So how do you get DC to pay attention to that? Is DC paying attention to that? Because DC doesn't seem to think in that term. So what would have to happen for there to be a policy that actually think about the north-south integration for our own sake, right? Right. And then seeing this impending disaster where the border issue is for sure going to have to be dealt with, and it will no longer just be illegal immigration coming to the U.S. for a better job. It is coming here for water and food because it doesn't exist down south anymore.
Right. I mean, we can estimate that roughly 2 Australias worth of land, good land across the lower latitudes, is going to go away. It's just not going to be livable. And we can posit pretty firmly that a similar amount of land, roughly 2 Australias worth, is going to open up in Canada, in the Nordic countries, and in Russia. Okay? That is a huge real estate transaction. No money changing hands. The rich get richer in the north. The poor get poorer in the south. I mean, that's going to drive people, just like the potato famine drove a lot of Irish over to the United States, or the German immigrants who came in during the Civil War when Lincoln was giving away land if you farmed it because he needed food production during the Civil War. We're going to feel the same kind of tensions, and we're going to see the same sort of opportunity. And if you think about it, that's how America settled its West with a lot of immigrants. That's how Canada settled its West. We're kind of built for this. We're kind of open to this kind of thing over time, but it is challenging because of the way it redefines America from its strong white Christian background. And that's why you're seeing a lot of resistance along these lines. It's the fear that we're going to lose our soul in this process because, whites were 90% of our country's population back in 1950. 2050, they're going to be more like 45%. We've never seen a country lose its dominant racial profile like that in a century. It's never happened. And yet, if you look at the Western Hemisphere as a whole is 45% white now. Okay? So we've been pre-mixed by colonialism going back 400 or 500 years. Asians have been coming here for hundreds of years. Africans were brought over first as slaves. Now they're coming as economic migrants. You got Europeans coming here. We've been mixing the major racial categories of the Eastern Hemisphere here in the Western Hemisphere for half a millennia. Okay? So we're built for this. We are already a mongrel population, and this sort
that's
of
an advantage, right? Yeah, that's a tremendous advantage because I think
heterogeneity is safer than homogeneity in nature.
And also, if you look at the strength of America, right, like the Constitution of this country is about integrating, right? It's about integrating different race, different religious beliefs, and we have actually demonstrated we know how to do so and create tremendous success from it, right? Certainly, there's been a change in the mixture of the racial profile, but we couldn't certainly say that it's been for the worse, right? Like the kind of innovation, explosive growth has all come from the mixing, the embracing of others.
Immigrants tend to start businesses more, new businesses more than native born, all that kind of stuff. Absolutely agree. The problem we have, getting to your question, is that the boomers and Gen Xers, 2 Cold War baby generations, are 85% of Congress. Okay. They see China and they say Cold War, containment, World War III, I know the answer. They see Russia, they say, I know the answer here. It's called containment, Cold War, World War III with the Russians. That's what they grew up with. That's what they know. Okay. If you think about like an AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she looks at immigration and says, we don't have an immigration problem so much as we have a climate change problem south of our border. We got an
That's an
economic
interesting
development. Right. So the newer generations, the millennials and Gen Zs, they're looking at this and seeing the world much more clearly than the older generations. So a part of this is simply the aging out of our current political elite. So I like to say vote early, vote often, vote under 50. And we're starting to see some of that thinking. You know, J.D. Vance represents kind of a stealthy Silicon tech bros, venture capitalist kind of mindset, you know, and that's more open and aggressive to this kind of integration notion, that's the real competition we got going on with China, and that we shouldn't look at ourselves as this static situation. We should look at ourselves like the Europeans do. The Europeans were 5 countries in 1957, the EU. They're 27 now. They got 10 in the pipeline. Okay? We grew the number of stars on our flag for 17 decades. And then we cut it off in 1960. Okay? Does it have to be contiguous? No. Okay? So we could bring on a Honduras. We could bring on a Costa Rica. They're better off coming to something larger with us than being at the tender mercies of the Chinese or trying to deal with climate change on their own, because all they're going to do then is send us refugees. And then we'll hate them and we'll consider them threats and we'll build walls and we'll send militaries to deal with them. And you already see that anger and that anxiety in the United States. And it shouldn't be. You know, we're built for this kind of integration. We should get back in the business of biggering, there's a Dr. Seuss term, biggering America, because when we bigger America, it gets better historically. Okay, we are an integrating force. I would argue we're the future of globalization in many ways. We got to get back to that sort of ambition and aspiration. And we should start in our neighborhood, because if we can't do it there, I don't think we can do it anywhere else.
All right, Dr. Burnett, we are coming up on our hour and we might start to lose people. I already saw 20 people drop off. So I want to make sure we touch on all the things that I wanted to ask you about and that I think our audience are interested in. So I've been scanning the chat box, and I think we've been pretty good in terms of touching on everything from geography, from climate, from the Belt and Road strategy.
Let me toss in one. You know, people say, how do you get this ball rolling? To me, and I've said this for years now, the 51st state. Get me the 51st state. I don't care if it's Cuba. I don't care if it's Puerto Rico. I don't care if it's the District of Columbia. Get me the 51st state. Once we break that mold and raise that possibility, we got younger generations. We got an attractive national brand. We've got all sorts of things that make people want to come and be like us. It should not be about keeping them out. It should be about extending our borders. If we're still fighting this out at the Rio Grande 20, 30 years from now, then we're stupid, because there's so much more opportunity. And it's not about conquering anybody or something like that. It's about inviting them into something better. There's your North-South integration. There's your new international economic order that the South has been begging for decades now. It's there if we're willing to make the sort of effort. And frankly, that's how we're going to succeed economically. That's where we're going to have stronger growth. You know, if you brought on somebody like a Costa Rica state number 51, you put them on an accession track like they did with Serbia and these other countries, man, the foreign direct investment would go down there. Because there'd be all sorts of reasons to take advantage and exploit and bring them in and raise them up and make it a better place to live, maybe a better place for American elderly people to retire because they love warm weather. You know,
all right, well,
all sorts of possibilities. But it's
I'm going to have to ask you to kind of bring us to close. And we've talked about so much, right? So I think it's usually helpful and hugely helpful for our audience to get like 3 key takeaways that you want people to remember coming out of this conversation. And I'll also do my best to make sure that I distill some of that conversation and give us some sort of investment nuggets before we close the session.
Yeah. U.S. style globalization created 3 outcomes, 3 massive world-changing outcomes. The first one is the great acceleration of consumption and everything else, all human activity that turbocharged climate change. Okay, that's the price that we're paying now for all that development. The second one is to join globalization and really get integrated, you have to go through a demographic transition. Okay, that's been played out in the North. We're starting to depopulate now. That's how you see the future of globalization unfolding as it shifts from China to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, to the Middle East and Africa. Okay, that's the price of admission. Climate change is the externality, the cost that we pay for this. The prize that we got out, the third element, is the emergence of a global majority middle class. Okay, and we got to understand that if that middle class doesn't rule itself, or submits to rule from the right or rule from the left, we're not going to be happy with that future, because we really prefer a political system. It's not so much democracy versus other things as it is it middle class centric? Is that where your center of gravity is? Because if it is, then it's fairly pluralistic on average. It deals with people's consumptions and ambitions. The rich want protection from the poor want protection from their circumstances. The middle class, though, wants protection from the future. And if you're good at protecting the middle class from the future, then your political system and your economic system is going to thrive, as it has in America, that has always boomed when the middle class is happy, and has always become fairly xenophobic and nasty whenever the middle class is unhappy. The middle class is unhappy right now. We need a progressive era. So those are the three big coming out of the experience that we had of changing the world, which is why I say your identity as an American is the most important identity any of us have. Because how we behave individually and collectively has shaped the world, has bent history, has literally recast our planet, changed it profoundly. The Anthropocene, the human epic, all that kind of stuff. We own it. It created tremendous good, but now there are new challenges, and we got to get off thinking in this east-west way. We got to start thinking more north-south. That's where the opportunity is. That's where the humanity is. That's where my kids are going to be willing to suffer and sacrifice to build that America, not one that's all about taking on China.
And I think it is important, because you just mentioned your kids. Now, this didn't come from you. I Googled this from the internet. Okay. Apparently, Dr. Barnett, you have 3 kids whom you adopted, and it's very much that integration plan, right? 1 from China, right? And 2 from Africa, right? So you are ahead of everyone in terms of integrating first the East and now the South.
That's after we had 3 kids, okay? The normal way. And then we started, we saw things and we said, hey, this world is tumultuous. It creates sort of geopolitical orphans. There's so much churn out there. We thought the best way to deal with it was sort of to sponsor 3 immigrants. Our daughter from China, 2 biological sisters from Ethiopia. And it is kind of hilarious in the sense that as the older kids went away, then it started to be like 3 global South, or 3 non-whites, and then my wife and I. And they looked around the dinner table and they said, you know what, Dad, that whole thing you talked about how the non-whites rise and the whites become majority minority. Well, it's already happening. And it has taught me a lot. And that kind of sensitivity is absolutely crucial. I mean, the alternative that we're being offered right now, kind of a white Christian nationalism, that is such a dead end for us. We're not going to make any money on that future. We need to be about DEI. We need to be about ESG. Think about 3 things: ESG, environment, climate change; S, social, demographic change; G, governance, who rules that global middle class. This is what we're talking about. Business to its own business finds the right things to concentrate on. It's when the politicians get involved and start telling you this is wrong, you got to do this instead, you got to focus on this sort of thing, or this sort of national identity. That's where we really go down the wrong path. And this is all about keeping America strong and wealthy and growing and bigger over time, because we do better.
Dr. Barnett, that's absolutely awesome, because I think for a very long time, myself as a researcher, and in fact, I got pulled into the UNPRI to set standards on ESG, right? Like, it's been a huge struggle for me to think about the DEI, the ESG, and make that make sense for investors, right? And so I think what you brought us today has been phenomenally useful to think about this north-south integration, right? This DEI is about our familiarity and ability to integrate a different race, right? And then the ESG, understanding how climate change is going to create a border problem and how do you get ahead of that.
It's all about imagining the future. It's all about thinking through scenarios. And once, you can't improve anything until you can measure it. You can't measure anything until you can see it. Okay. And DEI, ESG, a lot of these things are attempts to see the world more clearly. They're instinctive choices made by business, which, if left to its own devices, does smart things. But when you start layering in nationalism and white Christian this and that, then it becomes much more polarizing, and you get these culture wars that we're fighting now, which I think befuddle the world and damage our national brand intensely.
So I think we're running out of time. I do want to toss in some of what I learned from you today and make them as much of an investment lesson as possible. So the first thing, this north-south integration, I think it's phenomenal to see that the path forward is not U.S. competing with China. It's really, look, China, as it's getting older, right? It's moving up the value chain, and it's doing the hard work of integrating Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and then India, and then later on together to integrate Africa into the global trading ecosystem, global manufacturing ecosystem. And that's great for everyone, right? That's not something you want to stop. It's because it's work we don't want to do. Like you say, we're not offering a solution there. If someone else would, we stand to benefit. And it's important for us to understand
in certain ways.
Correct.
And we get all nervous about the Orwellian stuff that they're doing. Something they're comfortable with, it's something we're not.
And so it's important for us to see that is almost inevitable. How do we get involved? But importantly for investors, as you're seeing this happening, right? This is a movie we've seen so many times before. This is not a new movie, right? Like it started with the US to Japan, right? And you've seen the flow of capital, the flow of business, the ability to capture new consumers, the ability for US to license our IP to new, manufacturers, and to extend our brand to capture new consumers. But of course, China's doing the same thing. Japan is doing the same thing. So I think it's just really useful for us to go back and watch this movie and say, well, who made money? And how can we as investors, right, see the risk, but also see the opportunity so we position our portfolio appropriately. And again, I wrote a lot about demographics, as you have in the book. Yes. And my prediction has been the rise of emerging markets, the frontier markets, because of their demographics bonus. And that opportunity in terms of positioning your portfolio, right, where it's less relevant, the emerging markets, the emerging LATAM, the frontiers market, I think they're becoming so relevant. And their relevance is going to create a huge opportunity for, I would say, the more developed emerging markets, right? The China, the Taiwan, the Korea, who are now extending their network and their reach into these markets.
Right.
So I want to give, of course, the mic to you for, the final definitive statement before I cover some of the admin stuff. So, Dr. Barnett, back to you.
Well, I will tell you one of the most interesting observations, a couple of them that we got from the book, which is a highly illustrated book. It's got all these political cartoons, got all these data visualizations, because that's what Throughline does. It helps you imagine futures, get it down on a single piece of paper, create a common operational picture, and create coherence of vision and action within an enterprise on that basis. One of my friends from academia said, this book has so many pictures, so many cartoons, so many images, that it's almost like a graphic novel for futurists.
Completely agree. It's such a great book. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Because young people take in information that way more and more, and you gotta, go to the audience that you're speaking to, which is my point about DEI and ESG. We don't do it because it's a good thing. We do it because we're going to make more money behaving like that over time. And that's the big challenge.
Doing things out of self-interest work a lot better.
Yeah. The other thing I mentioned is a response I got from a geostrategist, a colleague of mine, who said, I read your book and I get it now. He said, the least racist superpower wins.
That's right.
Okay. And if you think about China's inability to deal with other cultures on some level, the Indians got their issues, Europeans got their issues with the the Muslims. You think about this pre-mixed Western hemisphere over here, where we all speak European languages because that's who integrated us and got us all mixed up in the last 5 centuries. I argue we're built for this. We've earned the right to be good at this, sort of like humans at the end of H.G. Wells' book, War of the Worlds. You know, we've built up our immune system and we've built up our DNA to be good at this. We should not fear this future. We shouldn't call it scary names like VUCA or BANI or these other weird terms that you come up with. We should look at it with some confidence. We can figure this out. And there are ways to not just survive, there are ways to thrive and to really build a better tomorrow.
And I'm going to call, a wrap on that. And I completely agree with you. I am, after all, a Asian succeeding tremendously in the U.S. because U.S. is a place that embraces you and embraces you to succeed. All culture, all race. All right. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Obviously, I want to thank Dr. Barnett for this conversation, your willingness to share what you have written so much, so extensively with us. Everyone, if you want to learn more, if you want to read more on what Dr. Barnett publishes regularly, he has a Substack. So in the resource section, you'll get a link to that. Definitely go on Amazon and get a copy of the America's New Map. I was very fortunate to have a digital copy and got to study and learn quite a bit from it. Also, of course, if you haven't already, in the resource section, do subscribe to my bridge. I talk a lot about some of the topics we covered today on demographics, but really from the investment side of the issue. And before you exit, there is a exit survey. So do help us get better by filling out the survey. So again, thank you so very, very much. And you can always reach us. If you want to reach Dr. Barnett, you can reach him through us and we'll connect you with Throughline. Again, thank you for your time. It's been great spending that last 1 hour with you, Dr. Barnett, and also with our audience.
I appreciate it immensely. I think your work is absolutely fabulous, as I've posted in my own Substack. I think we think along very similar lines. And I think this kind of broad framing of issues is absolutely crucial. We have to avoid narrow perspectives. It's not the way forward. It's not particularly American, and it's not the way we're going to stay rich or get rich.
Absolutely. And all of us on this call are very interested in staying rich and get rich. And then, like I mentioned, self-interest is often how we do great things. Paradoxically, that is just true.
Right. Incentives.
All righty. That's a wrap. Thank you, everyone, again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.